Hey everybody, this video is called Throne Secured, and tonight we continue our pass-through study here in the book of First Chronicles, looking at the 14th chapter, where we're going to be looking at the throne being secured in Jerusalem for David. And so, First Chronicles chapter 14, verse 1 and 2 starts out, "Now Hiram, king of Tyre, sent messengers to David and cedar trees with masons and carpenters to build him a house. So David knew that the Lord had established him as king over Israel, for his kingdom was highly exalted for the sake of the people Israel." So the events that we're reading about in today's chapter took place before those in our last chapter. You can kind of think of this chapter of where the chronicler takes a little break on the Ark of the Covenant to focus on what was talked about back in 2 Samuel 5, verse 11 through 16. And David, he had a great influence and importance. We see a good portion of the kings written in the Bible is focused on King David. And David knew how to build important political alliances. He had very good interpersonal skills to be able to build connections with others. And David knew that God wanted to use him as a channel to bless people. In verse 3 through 7 it says, "Then David took more wives in Jerusalem, and David begot more sons and daughters, and these are the names of his children whom he had in Jerusalem: Shemua, Shobab, Nathan, Solomon, Ibhar, Elishua, Elpelet, Noga, Nepheg, Javiah, Elishama, Beoliada, and Eliphelet." So we see chapter 3 verses 5 through 9 repeated in the text here. And we know that David directly disobeyed Deuteronomy 17:17. And 2 Samuel 5:13 tells us that David took more concubines as well, besides the wives, when he lived in Jerusalem. And notice that the chronicler does not mention the sin of David with Bathsheba, but after the murder of her husband, when she was one of the more wives that David added to his household in Jerusalem. And it was a moral failure contradicting the law, and his sin led to a whole series of disasters later on. And most of the troubles in David's life that he experienced, it came from his relationship with all these women and his children. In verse 8 through 10 it says, "Now when the Philistines heard that David had anointed king over all Israel, all the Philistines went up to search for David, and David heard of it and went out against them. Then the Philistines went and made a raid on the valley of Rephaim. And David inquired of God, saying, 'Shall I go up against the Philistines? Will you deliver them into my hand?' The Lord said to him, 'Go up, for I will deliver them into your hand.'" So we see that immediately as David became king, that he immediately faces challenges from the outside. And as David sought God and looked to God for guidance, he was blessed. And we see that God honored David's dependence on him and gave him the promise of victory. In verses 11 and 12 it says, "So they went up to Baal Perazim, and David defeated them there. Then David said, 'God has broken through my enemies by my hand, like a breakthrough of water.' Therefore they call the name of the place Baal Perazim. And when they left their gods there, David gave a commandment, and they were burned with fire." So at this battle of Baal Perazim, David defeated the Philistines with a very overwhelming force. And God's breakout and judgment that we saw in our last video now becomes a breakthrough, a blessing for Israel, as well as for Obed-Edom's household. And the Philistines, they brought their idols to the battle, thinking that it would help the Israelites. But because David inquired of God and obeyed God, they burned the Philistine idols. In 2 Samuel 5:21, it says that the idols were carried away, presenting an apparent contradiction. But most likely, the idols were carried away first and then burned later in accordance to the Mosaic law of Deuteronomy 7:5 and Deuteronomy 7:25. In verse 13 through 17, it says, "Then the Philistines once again made a raid on the valley. Therefore David inquired again of God, and God said to him, 'You should not go up after him. Circle around them and come upon them in front of the mulberry trees. And it shall be that when you hear the sound of marching in the tops of the mulberry trees, that you shall go out to battle, for God has gone out before you to strike the camp of the Philistines.' So David did as God commanded him, and they drove back the army of the Philistines from Gibeon as far as Gezer. Then the fame of David went out of all the lands, and the Lord brought the fear of him upon all the nations." So we see that the Philistines held a desire to ruin David before the throne was consolidated. And their plan was to kill David, but we see that God gave him victory over the Philistines, unlike Saul, therefore declaring both the Philistines and Israel his support of Israel's new king. And after the first battle, victory over the Philistines, David had the wisdom to wait on the Lord for the second battle. And to make note, David always triumphed when he sought and obeyed God. And God directed David differently in the battle this time. We see at the battle that David waited for the Lord to strike a camp of the enemy first. And the sign of God's work was going to be the sound of marching in the top of the mulberry trees. So for a quick wrap up here for today, we look at the royal palace of David. And we see through the chronicler the sons that are born to David in Jerusalem. In the chronicler, he showed how David sought God in battle against the Philistines at the Valley of Rephaim. And also, the chronicler showed David's defeating the Philistines at Baal Perazim. And we see that the chronicler ended the chapter showing David defeated the Philistines again. And now we are about halfway through this study in the book of 1 Chronicles. But we'll see you next tomorrow as we're going to look at the Ark of the Covenant once again being brought to Jerusalem. And the question to remain is will David do it right this time? So we'll have to wait till tomorrow to see. There will be no Topical Saturday. So I hope you have a great weekend up ahead. God bless.